now to Dilshad to give our introduction of our speaker this evening.
Sure. Thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to introduce Virginia. Virginia, she's a friend, she's a colleague, and it's really, she has a great experience, and I'm glad that she could share part of her experience tonight. So Virginia, she's a second-year master's student in the Department of Health Behavior at the UNC Gillings School of Global Public Health. And after she graduated from Barnard College in 2010, she served as a health education volunteer with Peace Corps in Mali for 2 years. During the political unrest, unfortunately, she was there, and she needed to be relocated to Rwanda for a year to work there as a national coordinator for stomping of malaria in Africa. Peace Corps Malaria Prevention and Control Initiative. And just before attending the School of Public Health here at UNC, she was working on a nutrition program at DC office for the DC office of the International Public Health Organization at John Snow. So welcome, Virginia, and please go ahead.
Hi, Dilshad. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here, and also say hi to Anant because we miss him at Gillings.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see? Yes.
Yeah. It looks great.
Okay, thank you. I'll hide your faces. Or maybe not. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so as Dilshad mentioned, I'm a rising second year in the Department of Health Behavior, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know him over the last year. And I'm really excited to be here tonight because I think there are probably a lot of shared values and shared experiences between Peace Corps volunteers and Rotarians. So I hope you find this interesting. A little bit about what I'm hoping to talk about today. First, I'll give you just a little brief overview of what the Peace Corps is and kind of what its values are, in case some of you aren't familiar. I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience in the Peace Corps, and then a little bit on some research that actually came out of from some friends of mine in the Department of Health Behavior on returned Peace Corps volunteers, and then we have time built in for Q&A. So a brief history of the Peace Corps was started by then Senator John F. Kennedy. He was campaigning for his presidency, and he rolled in to the University of Michigan at 2 a.m. and all the staffers and news crews had gone home because they weren't expecting anything to happen. And suddenly he took the stage at the student union at the university, and he gave a very brief speech asking how many students and how many people would be willing to serve their country and the cause of peace by living and working in developing countries. And that was in 1961. And so as we know, he did go on to be president. So when he became president, Peace Corps was established by virtue of an executive order. And since that time, over 220,000 people have served in over 140 countries. So Peace Corps has 3 goals. I think maybe the first one is the one that people are most familiar with, but the other 2 are just as important. So the first one is to help people of interested countries, meaning these developing countries, meet their need for trained men and women. So that's sending these volunteers who get trained in specific sectors into host countries that have requested their presence there. Secondly, to promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of people served. So that entails a volunteer at their site in their host country actively working with their friends and their coworkers in country to kind of teach them about life in America and what it means to be American, and kind of build that diplomatic relationship and that friendship between countries on a one-on-one friendship basis. And then lastly, to promote a better understanding of other peoples on the part of Americans, which is known as the third goal. And Peace Corps is very big on the third goal, and that is part of what I will be doing today. So what do volunteers do? Almost half of volunteers work in the education sector. I was a health volunteer, which is the second biggest sector. There's also community economic development, which is kind of like small business or enterprise development. And then environment, youth development, agriculture. And then this unique program called Peace Corps Response, which is specifically for volunteers who have already served in Peace Corps, excuse me, have a little bit more experience and want to return to Peace Corps, usually for a shorter time period, 6 months or a year, to do a high impact assignment. And that could be in any of the sectors. So where do volunteers go? As I did, 43% of volunteers go to Africa, but they're also all over the world. So there is no such thing as a typical Peace Corps experience. It could go one of 100 different ways. And volunteers are currently serving in more than 60 countries, which is pretty great. So as Dilshan mentioned, I was in Mali 6 months after I graduated from Barnard College with a degree in French, of all things. I moved to Mali as a community health volunteer, and then also, as Dilshad mentioned, in 2012, which I'll tell you a little bit more later, there was a political coup and some ensuing instability, so we were forced to evacuate, at which time I moved to Rwanda for a year to the day. So in Mali, if you were going to guess and you didn't know much about Peace Corps and guess kind of what a typical assignment was like, Mali is probably pretty close to that. You arrive in Peace Corps, usually service is for 27 months, so your first 2 or 3 months are spent in really intensive training. And that's part cultural and part language. Both are crucial to your success as a volunteer. So this picture that you see here is a picture, it's a hangar under which the volunteers would gather at the training center to receive some of their cultural or updates, cultural lessons or updates from Peace Corps staff, or just get together and socialize. But we spend most of our time living with host families in villages outside the capital. So they're probably the most patient people you will ever meet, along with the trainers who are responsible for leading you in this immersion during your first 2 months, who are Peace Corps staff. And they teach you everything from how to say hi in the language and travel and just to get by during your first couple months, to teaching you little cultural things that you might not know or you wouldn't pick up on without someone who is from that country instructing you. And so in Mali, the national language is French. Probably the most widely spoken language is Bambara because of the education system. A lot of people living in smaller villages don't speak French. But the language I learned is called Bomu, which is a minority language spoken by probably 100,000 people, maybe across eastern Mali and western Burkina Faso. And I was the only person to learn that language, which meant I sat in a classroom for 8 hours a day, getting one-on-one private tutoring in this language, which is fantastic, but was also very challenging. So when I moved to my site, you can see here, this is a picture of me with my health center staff. I don't know how good the resolution is on your screens, but you might notice that they're not really smiling. And Malians are actually some of the happiest and most welcoming and most charming people you will ever meet. They laugh a lot, but they don't smile in photos. So don't be fooled by this, but this is us at our health center. The outfit I'm wearing is actually made out of the anniversary fabric for Peace Corps' 50th anniversary, which was celebrated during my service. So we all got outfits made out of that. And you can see them wearing some traditional clothes as well. My village was quite rural. It was maybe 5 or 7 kilometers, depending on who you ask, off the main road. When I was biking it, it probably felt closer to 7, but really it was probably about 5. I worked at this community health center. I also did a lot of outreach with our local women's group. We started together. We started kind of like a sanitation committee working to promote, like to diminish littering in the community and to do cleanup clubs. I worked at the kindergarten working also with the women, but to teach, like to promote childhood development and singing and nutrition at the kindergarten that was established in my village. And I also did lessons on HIV and malaria at the secondary school, and we did a mural project. Art is a big thing in Peace Corps, so in the back of this picture, you can see, I did not make this mural. I think the first volunteer at my site made this mural, but art was always a great way to get your message across and get people involved in the work that you're doing and get them excited. And are not, oh, it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. So if anything happens, please someone just send me a message in case you can't hear me. So as Dilsha mentioned, we left in 2012 due to security issues following a coup. And that was very unfortunate. Actually, the day after, I had just gotten permission from the health director to stay in country for an additional year, but moved to Bamako, the capital city, to continue my service. They told us, oh, we need to bring you in. I see a message. Okay, sorry, thank you. Bring us into the capital, and we were in holding for about 2 weeks while Peace Corps was kind of trying to make a decision about what to do. They don't want to evacuate rashly or make decisions too quickly, but pretty soon it became apparent that we would not be able to stay in the country, and actually have pretty much all, it's called non-essential personnel working for the government, of which Peace Corps volunteers are a part of that group, were forced to leave. So they put us on a plane to Ghana, where we had a transition conference, and they presented all the volunteers with their options for what to do next. So at the time, there were about, I want to say 180 or 190 volunteers in country. Some of us had been there almost 2 years, and some people had been there only a few months. So with this wide variety, they said, some of you can sign up to do another 2 years. Some of you can go home, and you'll all have the same privileges if you had stayed for the full duration of your service. And because I had already decided that I wasn't ready to go home and I wanted to continue my service, I applied for a position in Rwanda, leading a program called Stomping Out Malaria in Africa. So one of the benefits of this presentation is that I can show you, again, that no two Peace Corps experiences are alike, even for the same person. So while on one hand, I did have a very small village, a village of 1,500 people, no electricity, no running water kind of traditional experience, I also had this very new and different experience living in the capital of Rwanda, which is Kigali, working out of an office that was funded by the US Agency for International Development, and kind of taking part in this international initiative that Peace Corps leads to, I guess, to encourage Peace Corps volunteers to implement better or more effective malaria prevention programs in their communities. So while before I was physically very isolated, a full day away from the capital and from Peace Corps staff in Rwanda, I was working with them really closely to make sure that we were achieving the objectives for the project, which I will talk about now. So this effort began in 2011. It's one of the coolest things about Peace Corps, I think, and it's a sign of the new directions that Peace Corps is taking, the new ways it is using technology and collaboration and partnership with other government entities to really push Peace Corps into kind of like a new era of development. So as I mentioned, the goal is to prevent malaria in Peace Corps host communities, host countries, and also internationally. And so what that means is that all the volunteers in sub-Saharan Africa, which unfortunately I don't know exactly how many countries that is, but quite a few, it's about 3,000 volunteers, are invited and able to participate in this initiative, in which volunteers in the capital cities or in regional capitals of each country kind of facilitate communication and learning between all the different countries in Africa to make sure that volunteers are using the most effective, the most proven malaria prevention efforts, because malaria globally can seem like a very daunting, problem. And a Peace Corps volunteer might say, I'm just alone in my village. Like, what can I really do about this? How time and give the most back regarding malaria, because it is one of the biggest killers of children under 5 in Africa. So in 2013, the program reached over 220,000 beneficiaries, meaning local people at the hands of Peace Corps volunteers. So I had a very cool video that I wanted to show you. So I sent, the connection was not good enough, but I sent the link to the video through the chat for those of you who weren't here. So I encourage you to look at it, in your spare time or later. It's very inspirational, and it really reminds you what Peace Corps is about and some of the huge benefits of the program. So what was I doing specifically in this initiative? When I arrived in Rwanda, the only malaria training that Peace Corps volunteers were receiving was a 5-minute presentation from the medical doctor telling them to take their malaria pills so that they don't get sick. But they weren't getting any sort of training on the science of malaria or how it works, how it affects Rwandans, how many people are getting sick with it each year, how many people are dying, common ways to prevent it, how it's treated, how they can advise people to take care of themselves better and to take care of their children. So it was my job and that of my coworker, Ariel, to build kind of this program from scratch, basically, in which we train volunteers in the technical aspects of malaria, how it's transmitted, give them tools to implement malaria activities at their sites. Trying to think. I thought I had a slide, but I guess I didn't. I apologize. About some of the specific ways that we did that. We developed a regional malaria volunteer network in which 1 or 2 volunteers from each region were kind of responsible for leading initiatives in their region to get more volunteers active and to do things regionally rather than people feeling like they have to just implement something at their site. Could be something big or something small. So one of the great pleasures I've had since I closed my service, which is the word that we use for when you leave Peace Corps, is watching that program grow. I think it's been really fantastic. So that is probably I would say my biggest success in Peace Corps is building up this program in partnership with Peace Corps staff and also the Rwanda Family Health Project, which is the USAID office that I worked at, to establish this partnership in which Peace Corps volunteers are seen as really valuable and being able to really commit in a meaningful way and in a bigger way than I think people think is possible. So we started doing this by kind of just, I went out there by myself and I was kind of the weird malaria girl who just showed up at these Peace Corps camps. So Peace Corps has really cool single-sex camps. One is called Boys Excelling, or B Camp, and one is called Girls Leading Our World, or GLOW Camp. So those are very big in Rwanda. So I talked to some of the coordinators and I kind of showed up and I said, can I please teach a malaria lesson to your kids at the next camp? So I went to 3 or 4 of those and I met this man named Simon who, he works for an NGO now, but at the time he was just friends of Peace Corps volunteers and lived in a community where Peace Corps volunteers were working. Excuse me. And he just like really took to it and he was like, this is really important. Like, this is what we should be doing. Here's what we got to do. And he just kind of took it and ran with it and started teaching the lessons on his own, which is as a Peace Corps volunteer, probably like the best thing you could ask for, because the ultimate goal is to be transferring capacity, like bringing your knowledge, sharing it with other people, and then eventually watching them implement it themselves. So that was a pretty cool thing that happened. And I hope, and I think, actually, I know that the single-sex camp integration has expanded. And since I left, the volunteer after me, she found a way to get someone to donate bed nets so that when we're giving them these lessons, we with a bed net so that they can go, and instead of someone just telling them, oh, you know, you really need to sleep under a bed net, here's the science behind it, this is why, please do that, but then you send them home and they might not have a bed net, or only a few people in their family might have a bed net. So being able to do that kind of, I think, brings the program full circle. So I really can't speak highly enough about this program, and I hope it's not one of the more probably well-known initiatives of Peace Corps. It's a little bit older. There are some new ones. The newest one is Let Girls Learn, which Michelle Obama is a big proponent of, so maybe you've heard of that one. But I think it's a really good example of the ways, as I mentioned, that Peace Corps is evolving and changing with the times and using technology and uniting volunteers into a process that is bigger than themselves. So next, I want to share a little bit of research that some of my classmates came out with. I took a qualitative research class this past spring as part of the requirements for the Health Behavior Master of Public Health program. And we got to pick our target audiences, recruit participants, develop a survey, conduct a study, and then present on it to the class as our final project. So 5 of my colleagues, co-students presented, and the title of their presentation was, "How was the last 2 years of your life?" Because I think a very common question when you come home is, so how was it? Or like, tell me about Peace Corps. And that's just an impossible question to answer, because it is such a big part of your life for so long, and it becomes a way of life, and it can be hard to explain that in an elevator speech, or even in an hour or half an hour, or even 2 days. So they gave a kind of tongue-in-cheek title to their presentation. The authors' names, the researchers' names are here on the left. And I want to thank them for letting me share some of this research with you. And so these slides have been adapted from their final presentation. So their main research question was, how does the Peace Corps experience affect the identity of return volunteers, as well as, I think, their integration of their identity while they're serving in Peace Corps as well. Their second question was, how does the Peace Corps experience affect relationships of return volunteers? And their research actually turned to be really interesting, looking at relationships while in Peace Corps, not just of return volunteers. And then lastly, how do Peace Corps volunteers describe their transition back to the US after their service? So their study design, it was a small study. They had 10 UNC Chapel Hill students, all who had returned within the last 6 years. Most of them are women. I believe they had 7 women and 3 men, but they had served all over the world. And the study, from those research questions that I just read you, the study ended up looking at themes of cultural immersion, changing relationships, and then the transition back home. So their main findings in cultural immersion was that all participants had different levels of cultural immersion, which makes sense. And they identified a list of different factors that led to either being more integrated or less integrated. So each of these things that I have listed here can either work for you or against you. Sometimes it's within the volunteer's control, and sometimes it's not. 2 volunteers can work in the same village or in villages nearby and have 2 totally different experiences depending on so many factors. But I think this is not part of the study, this is my opinion, but that the key to social and like job-related success in cultural immersion. So some of the factors that they found related to this are friendships, which I interpret as both local with your host community and with Peace Corps volunteers. They're both important and very formative, but for very different reasons. The work and projects that you do and how fulfilled you are in doing them and whether you perceive them to be successful, but also I think how integrated your community is with those projects and their perception of their success is also hugely important. Isolation, that can either be physical, as in like my village did not border any other villages, so if I ever wanted to go anywhere, I would have to get on the bike and bike uphill for 5 kilometers to go see another place. And that can also mean isolation from other Peace Corps volunteers. So for me personally, the closest volunteer was 25 kilometers away, but I never did feel that isolated. But that again could be totally different for someone else. Appearance, you're always or almost always going to stand out and people are going to know that you are a foreigner from a mile away most of the time. So that can either help you or hurt you. One interesting, maybe we would call it a perception about serving in the Peace Corps in Mali is the idea of the third sex, which is that it's a very hierarchical system, social system based on gender. So men obviously having the more power and women having lesser power, but then the foreigner, which in the Bambara language is called a tubab, is this kind of third gender that they don't really quite know what to do with. And so your level of power and prestige and the curiosity that people have about you and the respect that they give you is somewhere in between. So I think that's really interesting. Language is, of course, a big one and one of the biggest struggles I think that volunteers have, especially in the beginning of their service. And then religion, too. My village in Mali, at least, was probably half Christian, 45% Muslim, and maybe 5% animist or other or non-religious. So the family that I lived with was Muslim, but the family that I spent most of my time with was Christian. So we get to learn about all of these different things. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but asking about their religion and being curious about it and involved in their practices goes a long way. So by way of their findings for changing relationships, friendships in Peace Corps, they found to be based on a strong foundation of shared connection is the term that they used for it, which I would completely agree with, especially when you're talking about relationships with other Peace Corps volunteers. But their study participants found that the connection was lost or diluted upon return to the US when you leave kind of this bubble of people who have had a similar experience with you and suddenly you're on your own. And then the next slide, we'll talk about some of the difficulty that their study participants had in relating to their peers upon coming home. So what the common term, I think, to describe some of the difficulties or funny things that can be good or bad about returning to life in America is reverse culture shock. And I think a lot of volunteers would say, yes, it was very hard when I first moved to Mali or to Rwanda. You're learning an entire new life and language and culture, and that's very difficult, but it's equally difficult to come back and things, not only has your perception changed, but also, you know, the world that you come from has changed. So for example, when I left for Mali, I had the kind of phone where you press a button 3 times to type 1 letter if you're texting. And then I go, and that's the kind of phone I had for 2 years. And I come back and everyone has an iPhone. So just upon coming home range from smooth to completely overwhelming. They reported struggling a little bit with their friends' values and behaviors. One of them was very upset about people being on the iPhone all the time. Money was reported as a difficulty in this transition. And the grocery store breakdown was reported by 3 participants, which I can admit also happened to me, because when you go from having a limited diet and no food choices to a warehouse full of food, and you can have whatever you want, it can be a little overwhelming. So I think that's a common experience. So they adapted, or they created this summary model to kind of sum up, I guess, the findings of their report, which showed that identity as, I think, both a return volunteer and a current volunteer influences your relationships. And those relationships can be with your friends back home, with your friends in country, with your local friends in country, and they're always changing and they influence each other. And then both of these things too influence or kind of like decide or affect how you transition back into country. So for maybe someone who was very integrated and had a wonderful experience and maybe wasn't necessarily ready to leave, might have a more difficult transition than someone who maybe was not as integrated or didn't have as many connections, did not have as great of an experience. They might have transition a little easier. I had the additional challenge of having 2 transitions. The first one, when I moved from Mali to Rwanda, was difficult because I didn't have any sort of network and there were no people in country who had been through kind of that experience that I had just been through, being not only a volunteer, but also being evacuated. But then when I came home from Rwanda for good, I think the transition was a little bit easier because I had the fortune of moving to DC, where a lot of returned Peace Corps volunteers live and work. So there was a great community there for me to come home to. And then these things in turn affect, they found in their study, affect a volunteer's perception of their service, which I think hits the nail on the head. And maybe your perception changes over the years. It's certainly very different now for me than it was when I first got back. So in that way, I would love to see what other kind of research could be done on Peace Corps volunteers, because they chose this topic because not a lot of research has been done about what it's like to serve and the mental, maybe, and physical repercussions of serving. So I think it's really, really interesting, and I hope you liked it. And I think I'm right on time. It's 8:40. So now I think we have time for questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Virginia. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
I have.
Hi, Anant.
Hi. Virginia, it was an excellent presentation. Your slides were very concise and clear. Really, it was a very good presentation.
Aww.
I have a question. The question is that it's very important to go to the other country, do intervention and learn. But the most important thing is how to continue this relationship, isn't it? If you really want to bring a difference in others' life. So why you are not able to maintain these relationships? Because 2 years is a long period and we are get emotionally attached. In my case, I was a Fulbright scholar, but still I feel attached to all these people. I'm in connection with them. And basically it helps both with whom I am connected and myself also. So why we are all not able to continue this connections and relationships?
That's a very fantastic and thought-provoking question. So thank you. I think specifically with Peace Corps, as I mentioned, only one of their goals is really related to service and doing projects, and the other 2 goals are related to friendship and partnership and building relationships. And so obviously when you leave a country, and especially in an instance where Peace Corps is evacuated and they're forced, or they choose to stop all projects altogether, that type of work cannot continue, which is hard to see happen, but it happens. So I think in that case, it becomes even more important to continue that kind of social relationship. So as an example of this, the house that I lived in Rwanda was owned by a single woman named Agnes, and she knew all about my family. She was my friend, and I told her all about them. So I called her on Christmas this past year to wish her Merry Christmas and to check in and see how she was doing. Um, and she didn't, she didn't ask me about my work. She asked me like, oh, like, how are you and how is your family and everything? And I said, oh, actually, like, would you like to, would you like to Skype with my mother? Because my mom was sitting right next to me. So you can kind of keep that connection, but it's going to be in a different way than it was when you were there, because you can't obviously see these people every day. But that also opens up for a lot of new opportunities and ways to grow and continue to share your life with people that you did used to see every day and who shared so much and gave you so much. Keep that going. Facebook also helps. A lot of the kids now and my former coworkers have Facebook, so that's been really fun.
Thanks.
Did that answer your question, Anand?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pleasure of. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you for your presentation. It was very enlightening, and particularly having had the pleasure of working and getting to know someone directly from a Peace Corps. They just came back like 6-9 months ago from being 4 years in Guatemala. And it's very interesting, and I will be sharing this with her, that this study took place, because those are the very things that she shared with me, which was very mind-blowing for me, that she had more difficulty coming back than she did going. And even today, where you listed the friendships and the values and behaviors, is the number one thing I would say I got out of our conversation multiple times. She's lost a lot of those friends that she thought she had, uh, just because of how she changed, is what she says that they observed. She's actually downsized her life, not just her home, but in every aspect of her life. So like you say about the phone, everyone has a smartphone. She refuses to buy a smartphone. She's still doing the flip phone because that's what she had, and it was enough. So it is very interesting. I myself, going over to Tanzania, found, myself having just a slight adjustment. It was only, 20 something days. So it wasn't that in depth 2 and 4 years. And I wasn't in a village, but when you adjust to the way of life, whether it be how you shower, how you, go to the bathroom. I mean, these are very personal things. And when you actually adapt to that, you don't realize how much you lose and take on. And then when you do the transition back, you realize that you've been affected. So I really would like to see your study continue, and I'll be sharing it with Dr. Kate Young, who's a former anthropologist for University of South Carolina. She was the Peace Corps member for 4 years, and I think she would really be excited about that. But about the relationships, real quick, we do a cyber exchange with students in Tanzania as well as here. And it is interesting that now that I've gone twice, I'm very much a part of their family. And they, just even some I just met, some I didn't know, some I just met, they WhatsApp me every day. So that connection is so key. And what I've observed is, in particular, many the young ones are connected. They want to connect. They want to keep the connection. The older ones are kind of dismissing, in the sense that, oh, you're going to come and you're going to do, and then you're going to leave. And I think as a culture, the help that we've given, particularly in the West, over many, many years, this is how we have related to them. And so as much as they want to connect, I don't think they do the older ones at the same level as the younger ones, because they know what's going to happen. Eventually, you're going to leave, the project's going to end, the funding's going to stop, whatever. there's going to be a transition. And so to protect themselves, they don't make that deeper level of connection.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think being in an organization like Peace Corps, obviously I'm a little biased, but I think it's probably one of the best at what it does. I mean, you could argue, I won't say this is my personal opinion, but that the field of development and of Western aid going into developing countries is very flawed. But I think of those organizations, maybe Peace Corps does a pretty good job at kind of trying to blend the two and make sure that it's as meaningful as it can be. But you're right that at the same time, at the end of the day, you're going to leave, and they know that, and it can be very hard. And I can't speak to this as much just because we left so suddenly. We didn't have any warning, at least from Mali, when we were in Mali. But I imagine it's equally hard on them. So I do get calls sometimes asking, you know, when are you coming back, or why haven't you come back, or when you come back, you'll stay at my house. And I think it is a dream of a lot of Peace Corps volunteers to go back. But in this situation, for me at least, there are some fears about never being able to go home again. And so maybe in that way, that's kind of similar to the experience that you're reporting having had with these people through your program. But it brings up a lot of feelings about like power and privilege and what is really best, and maybe the fact that programs like this are really benefiting the Americans more than it's benefiting the people of the host countries. So I really appreciate it.
And I don't want to say that. Yeah, I guess, and that is the fine line, right? I don't want to say that they're not getting any benefit, but I think we need to build more sustainable ways so that they are owning it, and it becomes more, I'm coming to show you how so that you can do this for yourself and I leave, as opposed to I'm coming to do a service or I'm coming to give you something, and then when I leave it goes with me. I don't know. Somehow, yeah.
So if you're interested in this subject, I'll type it into the box as well, but I watched recently a Netflix documentary called Poverty Inc., which is about kind of this cycle of development and aid and people going in and determining needs in communities they've never been to and people they've never met. It's really interesting, so I think you would like it. So I definitely recommend it.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll watch it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Virginia, thanks so much for speaking. That was a really interesting talk, and you've given me lots to think about.
My mind is reeling again.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the transition from 5 minutes of malaria training to an actually full-fledged training, and did you meet resistance with that? Was that something that people were receptive to? And just, you know, how did that work for you?
Yeah. In hindsight, I kind of glossed over it because it's hard to sum up like a year's program in just a couple minutes. But so actually, your question reminds me that the resistance that we got was more from Peace Corps staff because time is tight when you're in a Peace Corps training and you have so much to cover, and they have priorities and a million things that they need to teach you before they send volunteers off to their sites. So some of the resistance we encountered was, oh, we don't really have time. Like, we can't give you a full day to do hands-on activities to teach volunteers, like how to repair a net or how to modify a net, or to teach them some local words, like in Kinyarwanda, in Rwanda, teach them words about how to talk about malaria. There just wasn't time. So for the first round of volunteers that came in after I arrived, it was kind of rocky. But then after that, I think the staff started to see that volunteers were really into it, and this could become like a really big thing because malaria is quite a problem in some areas of Rwanda. So after that, we started gaining momentum, and then that's where the partnership with Peace Corps staff really grows, and they start to get excited about it, which is, again, we're talking about sustainability. That's like something you really need to happen to be building an effective program, and then it kind of snowballed from there.
Wow, that's awesome.
Any other questions? Or if you're shy, feel free to type it in the chat and we'll ask for you. And while people are thinking of questions.
I'm sorry, this is Gene Perry, and I enjoyed your presentation. I do have a question. What happens after or post Peace Corps for you?
Oh, so yeah, I can only talk about for me because it's different for everybody. So immediately when you leave, you can Peace Corps will either they'll book a flight for you directly for you to go straight home, or you can take, kind of like a wad of cash. It's called cash in lieu.
Sweet, I think we lost her.
Was that my question?
Yes. You just stumped her there. It was a difficult question, Jean.
Oh, jeez.
Well, hopefully she'll be able to. I know there's storms coming through, so hopefully she'll be able to get back online in the next minute or so.
Okay.
But and like Kevin mentioned, oh great.
She's back.
Sorry. Hi.
Thanks, Virginia. Sorry we lost you there. So you were still in the beginning of your answer when we lost you.
Oh, so did you hear? Like, I went home to be with my mom, and then I decided I wanted to. Did you get that part?
No, we didn't.
No.
Just the money in lieu of.
And as I mentioned before, being in DC, I knew that a lot of the work that Peace Corps volunteers were drawn to, if you are, still internationally minded, happens out of DC. So that's where I decided to move. And a lot of returned Peace Corps volunteers live there. So I didn't have a job when I moved there, but thankfully it worked out. And that's how I ended up working at Jon Snow, Inc., not from Game of Thrones, but Jon Snow, the epidemiologist. And I started out as a temp and then was hired full-time. And after I was working there for about a year, I decided I wanted to go back to school. And so that's how I ended up getting my master in public health. So we technically are in the Gilling School of Global Public Health. So I think our education has kind of this global push, or at least like tries to integrate global and local into our education. So I'm hoping to move back overseas when I graduate this May, but who knows what will happen.
Wonderful, thank you.
Virginia, there's the water project that we're doing. We're working directly with students on both sides, and malaria, waterborne illnesses has come up, and particularly malaria. And I'd like to probably talk to you offline about how we can, work together. Maybe you can help with some programming and introducing students here, and maybe talking to the students in Tanzania further about malaria in your program that you had.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very exciting.
Virginia, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
I actually met with a Peace Corps volunteer to get information. At this age, it's very hard for people like me who need to actually save for retirement to volunteer. Do you see a lot of people that volunteer after retirement?
Yeah, when I was doing research for this presentation, I came across the number. I want to say maybe 7% of volunteers, so not a huge percent, but not 0%, are over the age of, I think, 60 or 65. So it is definitely possible. I could send you, there's actually a really great article about a man who served in Mali, he was not retired, but he took a sabbatical from his job to serve in the Peace Corps, and unfortunately got evacuated, which is so sad. but it talks kind of about the value of serving in Peace Corps as an older person. And we did have he and his wife and then one other retired married couple when I served in Mali, and both were really happy and actually some of the most effective volunteers in the program, for what that's worth. Yeah.
Very nice. I appreciate if you send me that link.
Yes, I will.
To the article. Thank you.
Great. So are there any last questions that we have for?
I think there's a chat.
Okay, let's see.
Oh,
okay. Well, so this is true. Kevin did mention that the Peace Corps and Rotary, they are, Peace Corps is one of our global, partners. So that's an exciting partnership there. I don't know of any I don't have any personal experiences or know of any projects that we've done with Peace Corps, but that would be a great opportunity if anyone hears about that.
I agree.
Yes. So if there are no other questions, then feel free to, if you think of any questions later on, feel free to ask and we can share that with Virginia. So thank you everyone for joining, and especially thank you to Virginia for her time tonight. We greatly appreciate your presentation. It was wonderful, and it was very eye-opening, your experience, and I'm very grateful for Dilshad for introducing you to us, and I hope you had a great experience too with us tonight.
I did. Thank you. And thanks for the certificate.
Great. And so you'll be getting that in your email.
Oh, yeah.
And then to close out our meeting tonight, I'm going to ask our membership chair, Chris, if he may have lost internet access. I know there's some storms coming by. So in lieu of him doing that, I'm going to ask Rachel, I know this is last minute, if you could read and lead us in the 4-way test this evening.
Sure, no problem. The 4-way test are the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And that's Rotary for tonight. And I hope everyone has a lovely evening.